My name is Jose Richard Aviles. I am a dual degree student with a master's in social work and finishing my master's in planning. And a lot of my work focuses on looking at the city as the client, right? And looking at what I call clinical planning and how do we bring in trauma-informed planning into the city. I am super excited to introduce these badass mujeres today, to bring them onto campus and to talk a little bit about that. But before we get into the dope-ass conversation we're gonna have. Oops, sorry, I don't filter my language, so you will hear a lot of words. I have to thank the Department of Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis, the Price Dean's Office and their Student Affairs Office, the Gender Studies Department, our Professor Lisa Schweitzer, Annette Kim, the Partnership for Equitable Los Angeles, PELA, my co-conspirator, Lynette Guzman, and the Latino Graduate Student Association. With that being said, let me introduce you to some of these dope-ass mujeres. First, we have Karolina Caycedo. Karolina is a UK-born Colombian artist living in Los Angeles. Her artistic practice has a collective dimension to it in which performances, drawings, sculptures, and videos are not just an end result, but rather part of the artist's process of research and acting. Through work that investigates relationship of movement, assimilation and resistance, representation and control, she addresses contexts, groups, and communities that are affected by development and extractivism. Caycedo is currently artist in residence at the Palm Springs Museum of Art. She's held residencies at the Huntington Gardens, Libraries, Arts and Art Collections, and a DAAD Artist in Berlin program. She was included in the Hammer Museum's 2018 Made in LA and has received funding from the Creative Capital, California Community Foundation, the LA Department of Cultural Affairs, Harpo Foundation, Art Matters, Colombian Culture Ministry, the Arts Council UK, and Prince Claus Fund. So now I'm gonna show you some of her work, cause yo. Karolina Caycedo. Next, I have the honor to introduce Marina Magalhães. I'm a girl, let me get your name right. Marina is a border crosser, bridge builder, and dance and change maker from Brazil based in Los Angeles. She has shared her unapologetically feminist and Latinx work throughout the US, Brazil, Cuba, Botswana, South Africa, and France, earning her an LA Weekly Theater Award for Best Choreography. Magalhães is a graduate of UCLA World Art and Culture Dance Department and a lecturer at UC Riverside, a resident choreographer with Viva Brazil Dance Company, and a resident artist at Peter Space in LA, teaching the weekly Dancing Diaspora class funded by California California Arts Council. She is currently pursuing her MFA dance degree at University of the Arts, guided by Thomas DeFrance and Donna Faye Birchfield, projected to graduate August of 2019. A little bit of Marina's work. Marina Magallanes. And last but not least is definitely Karolina Sarmiento, is an activist, scholar, and urban planner dedicated to interconnecting organizing, scholarship, and the struggles for justice in the city. She is currently an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She joined the Department of Civil Society and Community Studies in the School of Human Ecology in 2014. Karolina received her PhD from the University of California, Irvine in Planning, Policy, and Design, and received her MA from UCLA in Urban Planning. She has her BA World Arts and Culture from UCLA. Her research and teaching examines community-based planning, transnational development, and the creation and destruction of new democratic processes and cultural spaces by and for working-class communities of color. She was one of the founders of El Centro Cultural de Mexico's first center, an organization and radical space in Santa Ana, California, where local community work for immigrant rights, anti-gentrification efforts, and cultural autonomy. It continues to serve as a community and organizing hub in Orange County.
Toma 2, el son sin fin.
Karolina Sarmiento. So we were making the joke of, well, I made the joke that the panel is Marina and the Karolinas. So we figured that we're gonna become a decolonization band after this. So give us a space in an institution and we'll decolonize it for you. So the first question is this. So in your own practice and in your craft, what is decolonization to you? How do you define it as an artist? And where does it come in your craft?
Decolonization for me, and how I've started to put it in effect into my practice, is unlearning, a lot of unlearning. I'm just going to give a small example related to my last body of work. I've been focusing on how dams and other water infrastructures affect social bodies and bodies of water, and all the relationships that exist within what we call biocultural diversity. And when you refer to nature, normally we call it landscape, right? And as an artist, I had a formal training. Actually, I'm a Rusky graduate on landscape. So, when you're trained as an artist and you want to capture what you call landscape, quote unquote, you're taught that if you're gonna film it, you're gonna photograph it, the river should be, for example, if you're capturing a body of water or a waterfall, the water should, come from the top of the frame and flow down to the bottom of the frame, or come from the right part of the frame into the left, the way, we read our Western literature or Western language. But of course, that's how a Western eye and a Western gaze relates to nature. And if we think about nature, it's this frame, right? This rectangle. So we have two formats, classical formats, landscape, which is this horizontal, and portrait, which is more vertical. And landscape is normally a horizontal, but the thing with landscape is that normally it puts you as an observer outside of nature. You're kind of looking at nature through a window. So part of that learning, for example, in this particular example, is understanding that gaze that I was trained in as an artist through academy is a colonizer gaze. It's not my gaze, it's not the way I related to nature, it's certainly not the way that my roots, the people where I find my roots and the communities where I find my roots relate to nature, because we're totally embedded in it. It's actually what we call nature is the field where all human activity takes place, and all our relationships between other humans and non-human entities take place. So I've started, for example, making a series called The Water Portraits. And instead of trying to landscape a river, I've been trying to portrait a river, understanding that water, the forest, the stones, and all the other non-human entities in what we call nature are social agents, in environmental conflicts and environmental contemporary conflicts. They are entities with agency, with spiritual, political, and social agency, and economic agency. With the interdependence we have with these entities allows us to thrive as humans. No, so unlearning is a basic part of what I think and understand as decolonization. Not that you throw away what you've learned in an academy, but kind of how I do it is I approach institutions, and that's how I did my MFA here at Rusky too, as a buffet. Like what we had out there. You grab what you need, you make your plate, and the rest, it's not that you throw it, but you just leave it for other people who may need it, but you just take what you need, So the other way I think decolonization, or how I approach it also, is kind of understanding that as an artist, when I get an invitation to exhibit, to participate of a panel like this or whatnot, or as a student when I was also here studying at USC, that, that's a privilege. That's a privilege that I have in my hands. And I suddenly have a certain power and resources that come with that privilege. And that sometimes I'm in the position to redistribute that privilege and that power and those resources. Not always, sometimes you're not in that position. But if you're in that position, that's a good way to start decolonizing the space that you have managed to access, for example.
Thank you. There's something I caught on here. Okay, so planners in the room, throw away the 11 by 17 paper because it's colonizing the landscape. That's what I'm gonna do. Thank you. Marina?
This is such a huge question, and I was planning on sharing one thing, and then listening to Karolina talk, I'm like, I want to share a dozen other things. I'll just start somewhere and see where it takes me. I think to build off of what Karolina was saying, I think unlearning is huge. And my point of entry into this discussion is as somebody who works with the body, as a dance maker. And if I think about my dance training, my body was extremely colonized to be a certain way in the classroom. And really, I grew up feeling quite fragmented, actually, because I was training in the dance classroom, and those were white Western forms that I was training in. They were classical ballet, they were modern dance. And at home, and in my social life with my family, with my friends, I was doing completely different other kinds of dancing that were more from where I come from. They were Brazilian dances, they were Latin dances. And those two felt quite separate for me. There wasn't a point of convergence. I wasn't taught that actually samba and cumbia and salsa and those other forms that I grew up with were valid enough to be considered fertile ground for choreographic innovation and for imagination and for extrapolated thinking and all these things that we think of as choreography in the Western dance world. So I was taught in my dance education that, and it's incredible to think about this really through a decolonizing lens, because if we look at classical ballet, it is a dance form that's very, you know what? It is a dance form that's very high up. We're trying to be as tall and as high up to the sky as we can be. And there's a reason for that. It's not accidental. It's because in Europe, it's believed that God is in heaven. So we're trying to be closer to God through our dancing, to aspire to be higher beings. And if we look at Afro-Latin forms and forms of the Latin diaspora and indigenous practices, those forms are all somewhere down here. They're much closer to the ground. They have this intimacy, this relationship with earth and with these other elements in the body that are really quite different from this sort of linear, portrait-like, stagnant thing. And I think if we contain that only to the dance world, we're actually missing the amazing knowledge that can come out of that for all kinds of life and all kinds of fields, because the body in Western practices and colonial practices has been deemed lesser than the mind and has been deemed sinful, right? But if we bring a decolonizing lens to it, then the body can actually become an amazing generator of knowledge and can teach us how to be with the world. And that's been my decolonizing practice, has been very much an embodied practice and seeing the body as a crossroads, as this point of convergence where the individual meets the ancestral, right? And I practice an Afro-Brazilian spiritual practice called Candomblé, and it's I'm not initiated, but I'm a scholar of it, and I'm also a practitioner of it, and it derives from a West African religion called Ifa, and in these religions, it's believed that time is not linear. So it's also about decolonizing the body's relationship to time and space. Because we're taught through a Western lens that time, the past was back then, now is the present, and the future is ahead of us. But actually, through these other knowledge, makers, all of that is collapsed, and all of that lives together. So when I look at myself in the mirror, I'm not just looking at Marina, I'm actually looking at all of my ancestors, because this is a gift from them. So my past is completely present in my future, and all of that is constantly being activated towards my future, towards what's happening next. They're all coexisting. So this idea of the body as a crossroads to me is infinite possibilities, really. It's the individual meeting the ancestral. It's memory meeting futurity. It's divinity meeting flesh, and understanding that relationship between sacred and profane is actually not dichotomous but porous. And I think all of that gets taught to us, through what you were saying earlier too, unlearning what has been indoctrinated and complicating it but not in a way that throws things away, but that actually places us at a crossroads, that places us in conversation with all of these dualities, and how are we negotiating between all of them. Yeah.
I was like, yes. Y'all taking notes, right? This is better than any class you'll have in a couple of years. Karolina, decolonization.
So can I get a sense of who's in the room real quick?
Yeah.
So are folks, who's like an urban planner or studying urban planning? Cool. So who's not? Like, what are you, if y'all can just like yell out, like, I'm something. Director. Real estate development. Public administrator. Education policy. Cool. Nonprofit education. Very cool.
Planners, remember, the people that you plan for, they are at the crossroads, not the built environment, the people.
So thank you for sharing who you're at. I come from maybe an intersection of a lot of these things, including dance. And so when I think about decolonization, I do think about the mind, I think about the body, I also think about land, right? And so when we think about unlearning, it's a process, we're unlearning practices that we haven't just learned in the past, but that we continue to learn, right? So it's how do we address, in whatever situation that we're in, the systematic destruction of our communities, right? And when I say the systematic destruction of our communities, I'm talking about from the land, from what we eat, from our housing, to our dance, to our bodies, right? So decolonization to me is thinking about not just the historic process, but the current process that we must engage in at all those different levels in order to not only address those institutions that continue to destroy our communities, but then also build new institutions. How do we build new community spaces? So I don't have a label for myself. I feel like I'm constantly at a crossroads. But I feel that a lot of my work engages in building community-based, radical, cultural institutions, right? How do we build spaces where we can resist, right? Where we can resist in everyday practices that have become forms of resistance. I always put the example of like, I'm from Santa Ana, California. In Orange County, we had a zero tolerance policy around speaking Spanish in the classroom. So imagine one day we came to donate a whole bunch of books in Spanish to one of the classrooms, and that was a form of resistance because they were denied, right? So when every day things that make up who you are become an act of resistance towards the state, right? So how do we create spaces that are alternative forms of the city? So for example, when we think of culture and planning, when we think of culture in planning, it has been minimized to commodity, right? How do we create spaces where we can sell our culture? We are highly limited by the frameworks we use. Unfortunately, theories of multiculturalism have led to these ideas that our culture is valuable because it can be sold and purchased, right? And then other theories like assimilation lead us to believe that the only way we become valued is if we are somehow integrated or assimilated into the mainstream culture. So if we are coming in as planners or educators, I think the theories of decolonization are no longer just theories, right? They're actually questions of how do we put into action these forms of resistance, and what do the spaces that we create look like, and what does our relationship to land look like, right? So a lot of the kind of work I do are questions about how do we keep people in their homes? How do we keep cultural spaces from being appropriated and co-opted? How do we develop forms of self-governance that aren't necessarily top-down? How do we remember what we forgot, right? We have a lot of examples that still exist. How do we find those teachers that are still there, and how do we ensure their survival? And how do we remember that at the center of this are anti-capitalist values and not questions of commodification. How do we hold culture to those types of standards and not the other standards that have been imposed on us?
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, it's very important what I see that Marina and Karolina mentioned, no? It's like there's been a number of knowledges and ways of producing knowledge that have been stigmatized, no? And more in places like institutional academies like this one. So I always imagine that my best, if I could make a university, I would make a university of abuelitas, of grandmothers.
Yes.
Because they are amazing sources of knowledge, no? You know, and the body, Marina mentioned it, the body as a source of knowledge. So also, you know, as students, or we all like cultural makers, cultural thinkers, cultural workers at the end, right? You know, to ground that research in your own body is like that's really to ground, you know, your practice in the practice of decolonization also, I think so. And it's clear in Marina's work, or even clearer because she's a choreographer, but we can always ground it, no? And I've been working around dams, and you cut me when I'm getting too long, but you know, thinking about what are the dams, you know, I think also about decolonization like an undamming process, if you wish, no? And like, what are the dams that we put on ourselves, you know, even before thinking what are the dams for others out there, what are the dams that are stopping me from flowing? That's like the first question that you know, so to ground that process on those questions in your own experience, like, you know, you did in Santa Ana, that's where your roots are, that's where you started, all this process, and then it grows, no? I think that's always an important step, and that sometimes it's not so easy, because when you touch base, it hurts, no?
Yeah.
But,
so you actually hit the segue that I was going to. So there were so many things that came up. So I heard, right, that we are our intersections. And I think very interestingly enough is that we who are trying to study planning, right, there are issues that are happening in the city in the now, but we're trying to build solutions for the future. A lot of the times our projects will not be constructed. We will not see that happen. We propose ideas and changes to the built environment that will happen 20 years from now when the community will shift. There is an opportunity, I believe, in planning that we live in that intersection, right? Like the temporality within planning it's fascinating. So the question, and you were getting to this, is, okay, I'm gonna wake up today, February 26th is Tuesday. You know, my life has been colonized. I'm ready to decolonize it. Where do I start? That's what I want y'all to do tomorrow. You know what I mean? Like, so I'm facilitating that for y'all, right? So I wake up and Karolina said it's a process, right? And finding the dams in your body as a first step. Anything else to add? Like, where did you start? Because, yeah, that's a...
When I first started thinking about this, it really was, for me, coming from it almost felt like a selfish desire. Like I was saying earlier, like I felt really fragmented on the one hand, I was a modern dancer, I had this ballet training, and then I was a salsera, I was a sambista, and I didn't understand how those things came together. And so I started from a place of like, I want to feel whole. And how do I negotiate these parts of myself that feel like they're at odds and at war constantly? And like maybe they're negating each other, like they can't coexist. So that was where I started, and I started really through my dance practice. But then something that I really arrived at when I went deeper into that was to really sort of accept and embrace that decolonizing, I believe, is an impossible act. I think we have to begin from a place of, you know, we can't go back in time and stop from happening what happened. We are living in the aftermath of that. So it's impossible to actually do this thing called decolonization, because colonization is not a metaphor. And there's an amazing essay by that title that I think everybody in the world should read. Decolonization is not a metaphor. I believe it's by Eve Tuck and W. Yang. Don't quote me on that. But if you search for it, you'll find it. And they make the claim that, you know, it's really dangerous to talk about decolonization as this buzzword, as this thing that we can sort of do and we can claim that we're doing, without looking at really concrete things and looking specifically at settler colonialism. And we have to understand that we are settlers on this land. I am a settler on this land as a Latina immigrant and all these other things. Like, I am a settler on this land. This is Tonga land. And we cannot leave that out of the conversation. That's huge. And at the same time, like, I also believe that decolonization is not a goal, is not a destination that we can arrive at. I believe it's an ongoing practice forever and ever. Because specifically we can't go back and undo it. So we're always going to be living in this aftermath, and we're always going to be housing this duality of oppressed and oppressor. I have both of those identities, and I have to grapple with that. So I mean, that's my first thought about that.
And also because colonization is not over. Like Karolina mentioned it. Like, people think about the colonization as something that happened 500 years ago. I don't know. It keeps going on.
And we have to understand, and this is really important to me. I was born in Brazil, partially raised in Brazil, and I still go back very much for work and for family. And I don't use the word American. I choose not to. I believe America is a continent, not a country. And I believe before I became a U.S. citizen, I was American because I was Latin American. And we have to understand that the United States today in 2019 is the colonizing power of the world. You know, so I conduct this travel study program through UCLA where I bring UCLA students to Brazil to study in Rio. And that's something that I think maybe especially the students of color really grapple with, because on the one hand, you can be somebody who experiences so much oppression in this context, and then when you travel outside of the United States, you really are the oppressor in going to these places that have had their necks with this boot, the boot of the United States on their necks, because the U.S. is the colonizing power of the world today, period. Like, there's no argument about that. It absolutely is. Before I moved to the United States at age 14, I had watched 1 million movies from the United States, 1 million shows. I knew more about U.S. history than I did about Brazilian history. That is crazy. That is so crazy. Like, we need to grapple with that. It's still going today, and specifically through this context that we are all living in and contributing to.
All that said, Karolina, I want to see if you can touch upon, so as Marina and Karolina have talked about, you know, that process and how it's impossible and it continues to happen, I think one of the most prevalent and apparent forms of colonization that's happened in our profession is redlining. And redlining is no longer a thing, yet we still feel like my communities have been redlined. So how do you begin to decolonize that practice? And yes, there are still deeds that have racial covenants in them. It's unconstitutional to enact them, right? But it's still there. So how do we process that trauma of redlining in the decolonized lens?
Wow.
We going in.
Yeah, I feel like, one of the, colonization has harmed our communities in so many different ways. And I think one of the primary ways that I see it while working in community spaces is the fact that we at one point had processes and practices that included our bodies, that embodied practices to deal with trauma. And we have forgotten those processes, and we've forgotten those practices, or they have been purposefully destroyed, right? So when we think about loss in our families, when we think about loss of a home, when we think about the trauma that you must go through when your house and your home is destroyed, what is the process of mourning that we go through, right? Here we have funerals that happen in like 3 days. Communities come and go, right? You don't even know what happened to a space. You come back and you're like, what happened to that space, right? These places that were sacred come and go. We don't have processes of mourning. And I feel like our processes oftentimes don't involve our bodies, right? They don't involve letting out whatever is like actually physically inside our bodies, right? Like yells or cries or just getting into a different stage of consciousness, for example, through dance. So I feel like one of the processes of dealing with the redlining, the segregation, the gentrification, displacement, the disinvestment of our communities, is to start figuring out how, as a community, we can begin to heal and acknowledge. That would be my first step. Heal and acknowledge that history. And by healing, I'm not saying forget it. I'm saying come to a space where we can actually collectively speak about it. I feel that history isn't, when you said like tomorrow if you want to wake up and be like decolonized, I feel like a lot of folks, the first step might be acknowledging that that history happened, you know, or figuring out what that history is on all our sides, right? Like speaking to our abuelitas and our abuelitos about what happened, what our history is, or also speaking to our grandparents and grandmothers who might have a racist past that we also need to acknowledge, right? So all of that, how do we start doing? And I think redlining isn't an exception, right? Or segregation and gentrification. So how do we acknowledge that? And then after acknowledging that, in that collective space, what kind of new practices can we create to imagine a different alternative? You mentioned settler colonialism. I think one of the tools of settler colonialism that is also so harmful is the ability to take away our ability to imagine something different. It's like suddenly we can't imagine something different, right? That question of hegemony, or that question of like normalizing violence, right? These ideas that you just think that these things are normal, right? So how can we collectively imagine something different, right? It might have already existed in our own histories. We might actually have some of that knowledge within us still of how things could be different, right? So I think those are some of the first steps, I would say, in seeing how that history of redlining that continues to exist. And of course, there's all these organizing skills that go around that too. Like, I believe in power analysis. I think all those skills are like really, you know, one-on-ones, door knocking, neighborhood organizing. Like, that's all part of it, right? And I feel sometimes what happens in our discussions as community-based planners is that we somehow separate the struggle to decolonize from the struggle to community organize, right? Like, we have to figure out how those two struggles and those strategies and tactics come together, right?
Getting together is very important, and just in damming, the first dam we put on ourselves is just being silent and accepting the situation or the giving, no? So understanding that, you know, it doesn't matter how big is that dam and how rooted it is, it always can come down, right? You know, as planners, concrete has a lifespan, and, you know, it eventually starts to erode and it will come down. So, you know, just like really understanding that there's always a possibility to bring those dams down, and sometimes finding those alleys within the institution. There's always alleys normally. So finding them and being able to kind of streetwise or a little bit, trying to be able to identify. And you recognize your peers, you know, and those that are on your side, even more when you're in a paternalistic institution. So, you know, building those alleys and like resistant to be cutthroat in the competition, but allowing for that kind of community to build is important. And also, I'm just going to put the example of the Huntington maybe just to ground the answer. So I got invited to be in residence at the Huntington Gardens, which is the second most expensive museum to visit in the country. I think it's $28 to go in. You have to be a scholar backed by an academy or by a publishing house because you're writing a book or something to get a readership. And suddenly me as an artist, I got a readership. And, well, suddenly no. Of course, it was a lot of hard work. But, and I know, because I've been working and I've had this body of work around dams and water issues and water infrastructure, that it was expected of me to probably tap into all that archives. They have a bunch of archives of the whole, you know, New Deal, the way the LA Aqueduct and the LA River, you know, channeling and whatnot was produced. And they have tons of information. And I kind of knew that the expectation was that I was going to tap into that information and work and produce work around this issue. And I I didn't do it, and and I wanted, because I was waiting for it, and I had actually applied for readership to the Huntington to actually tap into those archives. And when I got the opportunity by their invitation, then I resisted that urge, and actually invited Marina, Richard, and the other people you saw dancing to acknowledge the land and the place of the Huntington, just where we were standing. So again, like kind of get closer to that place, kind of heal it in a way through our bodies, and just by having this brown, black, queer bodies hold that space in that very white, constructed, if you want to talk about constructed landscape, just go to the Huntingtons, and it's important to understand healing, and there's parts that we've healed already. So strengthening is important. Not only just be skipping on that rhetoric that we need to heal. We've healed. We still need to heal a bunch, but some things what we need to start is to thrive. So also, and to get stronger. So how can we start thriving together and get stronger together? And also, as cultural makers and intellectual, workers and cultural workers, language and again, just starting about the most basic, which is how we communicate to others, being very clear in how we use our language. So, educating the institution, and when they're using paternalistic, sometimes they put out their job offers, or they invite you because you're going to be the voice of the community, or we're going to help this community. It's like, so also educating about, what are those neoliberal structures that they are using to put out their plans and their languages. There's some word that I always am very critical about, that word of sustainability that's thrown around. We even talk about how we can have sustainable institutions, sustainable art practice, And that's just a word to make us feel better about a system of consumption and production and consumption that's never going to be sustainable. So going back again into understanding that those capitalistic values are not going to take us out of this mess. Thinking about, maybe instead of sustainable practices, sustaining practices. That has to do more about nurture and taking care of each other. So language is a very important place to start.
How you feel about sustainability, I feel the same way about opportunity. When developers come in, it's like, oh, it's an opportunity. Opportunity for whom? That's my first question, right? And I think for me, it's also that it's we need to build strategic partnerships, right? I have background in it as a social worker and a planner. But that pro forma, what's up? I don't know too much about it. The only thing I do, I make a joke about Hogwarts, and I call the real estate. Never make, maybe I make, whatever, fuck it. This is my decolonizing in practice. But I call the Emirates students the dementors of price, and we say expecto pro forma. It's a weird, funny joke. But anyhow.
Expecto patronum.
Exactly.
Get it right.
But I think it's having that conversation of the strategic partnerships. How do we talk to one another? How do we trust that your expertise is just as the same value as my expertise, and how do we come into it? And you mentioned something as well, this idea of community engagement, it's never linear. So a lot of the times what happens in the planning profession, let me tell you, they're going to do community engagement 3 years after all decision-making processes have been made. And it's here you go, community. You're going to get affordable housing, and you're going to get this. And you're like, but I didn't want that. But what about the bakery? So how do we collapse, right? Do we let community engagement collapse, and the design process, procurement, construction, and programming, the whole process?
So planning, we are so upside down sometimes, right? Total galianos, el mundo al revés. We always are thinking about how do we integrate community, how do we include community, as if community isn't at the center. So it's how do we start from community, right? So it's oftentimes the planning process exists, and we're trying to figure out how to bring in, as if community was an input, as if community is a thing that we put into the process. Whereas you're building in our community. So it's how do we create community institutions that can tell you what they want? And that is the process. The process is actually being led by community. And we were just having this conversation. It would be great if planners worked on behalf of the community, right? I went to planning school because Gilda Haas, who was one of the founders of the Rights to the City Alliance, one of the founders of SAGE, or the founder of SAGE, told me that she became a planner because she wanted to learn about the redistribution of land. I was like, oh, redistribution of land, I want to do that. That sounds like something I want to do on behalf of the community. And then I went to planning school and found out that planning isn't about the redistribution of land for people of color. But I feel like, how do we create planners who are working to build that community-based knowledge, that technical knowledge that we sometimes need in order to communicate and convince and retake our land? So for example, Santana, we have 99 publicly owned parcels of land that the city owns, and they want to sell 88 of them in one RFQ, right? What would happen if you, for example, who know all this stuff about real estate that some community folks we don't have, would come to our meeting today, 6 o'clock, Santana, you show up and you listen, and you see what the plan is. What is the plan? What are folks on the ground trying to envision, imagine, recreate? Because that planning is happening. We just need some of this capital to come and support those processes. And that's not integrating the community at any point. That is the community plan, right? So how do we build from there? And I can also talk about how the city can improve their community engagement processes. We can also talk about that too. But I rather focus on this other aspect. We need you at those meetings. We don't need you on the other side. We need you in our meetings.
That was a real call to action today at 6 p.m. I was like, wait, yeah. So I have one more question. I'm going to continue asking. I'm going to come back to this. Because Marina, you mentioned something earlier, and I wanted to connect to this. This idea of body as a pool of knowledge. Can you share with us what principles and values that come from body could be scaled to the city?
Ooh, I like this question. I'm gonna piece together two things, because I think what you just said is so huge. And if we're really having this conversation with this language of decolonization, that is so fundamental what you just said. Because something that I work with, that I've been working with very much in my MFA research, is Audre Lorde's "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House" essay. If you're not familiar with it, look it up. It's fundamental in feminist, anti-colonial, studies. But she poses that we can't keep using the master's tools thinking it's going to dismantle the master's house. We can't keep doing that, right? They go together, actually. There's content in form. So what we got to do is actually dismantle the form and reimagine new and different forms, which is also what I heard you say earlier. And what you just illustrated, I think, is a very concrete example of this is a new form. We're not gonna try to integrate community. That form is corrosive at its core. We're gonna do this other form. So thank you for that. Okay, your question.
Some of it made sense.
Yeah. Okay, your question. So right now I'm doing one of the projects that I'm doing in my research is called Joints. And it's looking at, it's imposing the logic of the body onto the city so as to better understand how the city is being mobilized. Because that's another way that our understanding of place becomes really colonial, is when we think of place as static and place as sort of never changing, and it's just there, it's external. Whereas in indigenous or Africanist practices of the Latin diaspora, we understand place as living, breathing, and connected to body. So, for example, earth, water, air, and fire. Those 4 elements in Afro-Brazilian spiritual practice are believed to be housed in this body. And this body carries all 4 elements, and that connects me to my surroundings. Even here, even though this is a completely, man-made space, there's element earth here present, there's element air here present. All of these elements are present. But so much of the way that cities are planned and thought of disconnect them from those natural processes. And the body is this mobile, breathing thing. And the city is as well, but we don't treat it that way. And what happens when we treat it that way is that all kinds of things become stagnated. and that creates disease. So if we look at how that works in the body, maybe we can start to better understand how that works in the city. And my group's project, it's not just me, but 2 other collaborators of mine, our project is looking at specifically sort of the synovial joint as a metaphor for that, as an analogy and understanding of that. And synovial joints are, your elbows, your knees. It's these joints that have all these different functions and mobilities in our bodies. And synovial fluids in the synovial joint provide 3 things. They provide viscosity, and viscosity is that thing that slows down time. So when I jump and I land in my jump, the fluid creates viscosity in my joint so that the moment of impact is not so brutal, but that actually my joints they're kind of softening and cushioning. So it's slowing down time, right? There's mobility. The synovial fluid makes everything a little bit more slimy, more mobile, right? It's not dry, it's mobile, it's fluid. And then the third function is transfer of nutrients. Things come in and things go out. So the synovial fluid is providing nutrients to come into the joint, and it's also taking out waste, toxins, things that aren't helpful anymore. So if we impose that logic onto the city, then we're asking ourselves, who in the city is providing mobility? Who in the city is providing viscosity? Who in the city is providing this transfer? Who in the city is doing this work of mobilizing the city so that it doesn't stagnate and create disease? And one of the ways that it's thinking of the city of LA in particular that my group has become really interested in is the LA River, thinking about rivers and damification, because the LA River kept shifting. And if it kept shifting, it wasn't going to allow planners to construct the city the way that they wanted to. So they decided to pave it down as an attempt to control it. But now we know that the LA River is almost like a ghost. It's almost like a memory of a river. It's dried out. It's not providing any of the original, the original things that it was doing as a wetlands, as an active ecosystem. It's no longer providing any of that, and it's become stagnated, and that has created a drought. All these repercussions have come out of treating the city as if it were something that we could control and impose control on, rather than connecting to it as a living, breathing thing that we need to be in conversation with. Just as our bodies are mobile, so is the city.
So in everything that I'm hearing, creating new forms, right? Creation, I'm hearing subverting legacies. I'm hearing bringing back nutrients. I'm hearing so many things. And when I apply to the program, being like, look, I'm a choreographer. My job, my professor said that choreography is the manipulation of space, time, and energy at its essence. And we have tools for how we do that. But I was like, oh, then I design space within space. I am a planner. And so I applied. And then I got it, and then they say in design, and I was like, oh, I don't know how to do that. But this idea that choreography, right, in this essence, I think that there is a choreography to the city, that the choreographer should be a planner. But a lot of the times in how we have seen the city, from Olmsted to Le Corbusier, right, these patriarchal men who have seen the city as object, right, through the male gaze, as this thing we eat up, as this thing that we consume. What does the Jota feminist planner look like? And so that's kind of the question. What does the feminist Jota planner look like, and what is the choreography of the city?
No, but it's great that you bring that up. If we think about architecture and planning, it's been mostly designed by men. We live in masculine places. We actually don't. It's great because we can imagine so many ways what a feminine house would look like, or what a feminist city would look like, because they're none. They're all designed by men. You know, this rectangular space was designed by a man probably, and we inhabit it. So it's man gaze and man sensibility that defines how we move in space, how we move around the city. And that's important to acknowledge. I think also it's important that you had the trust in yourself and to throw yourself at planning, because I think at this day and time, corporations are doing that. They have all sorts of disciplines in their rosters. You know, they have storytellers, they have artists, they have designers, they have coders, they have choreographers, they have chefs, they have everyone. If we want to fight this monster, we have to work together. And we have to do interdisciplinary working tables. That's why I love that you put us together at the beginning. You know, like, yes, we have conversation. You can see how rich it can get. So also that's an invitation for you as planners, directors, community workers, whatnot, all the disciplines that are represented in this room, to work together. And don't think, oh, you know, we don't have nothing to say to each other because our language and, you know, our way of working is so different. Actually, that's where the richness comes in, and the possibility of even wider, wild imagination comes from, when all these different things come together, no? So I definitely encourage more panels like this, interdisciplinary panels, you know, like, maybe people think it's out of place. It's not, you know. The other part is doing it already, and, you know, they seem to be running faster in a way. It's not that we want to run faster, you know what I mean? Because it's not about like trying to cut ourselves or hold us accountable under corporation standards. It's not about that either, no? But I think interdisciplinary working groups and working tables are very important.
Thank you.
Yes, I don't think you mentioned a really difficult thing for me, right? It's like we don't want to run as fast as them.
No.
We know that processes are slow. However, we
There's
are
an urgency.
also, there's an urgency because those processes, we have to be able to catch up with them because they're impacting our community. Right? So one of my professors like in life, not like in school, like told me, she said, you know, as community folks, we're building two paths at the same time. One is our path, is what we want, is imagining the future that we want. And that path we know needs to be slow because we know processes take time. However, there's this other path that it's the city's path and vision for us, right? Or the capitalist neoliberal city's path and vision for us. That one's going fast. And they already know what they want in your neighborhood. They know what they want in the next neighborhood. They know what they want in the building and the house that you're living in, right? And that one's going fast, and you need to be able to respond.
Yeah.
Right? So it's both of those at the same time. And so it's like, we know it takes time, and we don't want to work like you, but at the same time, like these systems that are, you know, have long legacies. That's why decolonization framework is important. These systems are working really quick, and they do have the funds to bring in all these. They understand that disciplines are not the way to work, and that they need all these different interdisciplinary fields to come together to do this right. To take all the juice out of the culture that we provide every single day as much as they can, to squeeze as much. And we need more of these spaces. And actually, my friend over here from real estate, that is so dope that you're here. Like, we need to be talking to folks from different disciplines and be like, all right, how are we doing this together, you know? And yes, thank you so much for this. This has been amazing.
I'm like, I've been taking notes.
Me too, all of us are like.
I do want to do this. We did have a conversation, and we talked kind of offline and realized that, again, in an urban growth seminar that I've been here and in the history maybe of the series, we have not had 3 women be on a panel and 3 Latinas be on a panel as well, and then moderated by a Jota. Like, I mean, we subverted as much as we could, and we realized that this had to continue on. So I am going to give you my email. We still don't know what this conversation and follow-up looks like. There's ideas, but we are down to continue the conversation. And I can continue and be a liaison from here to our panelists. We might do something. We might do a piece of art. We'll find the capital. If you know the capital, we'll do something. So my name is Jota, not the whole thing, just the J, JRAVILES@usc.edu. That's JRAVILES@usc.edu. Yeah? Yeah. I think so. Yeah, and just send me an email. We'll stay in touch. All right. Thank you so much for coming. This concludes the end of our panel.